Good morning. I'm going to be reading to you this morning from the book of John, chapter 5, 1 through 14. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem, or at least for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem, in the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who has been there, an invalid for 38 years, when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you not want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool where the water is stirred. Whenever I'm trying to get in, someone always gets down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and the law forbids you to carry your mat and walk." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick up your mat and walk?" The man who healed Jesus, he had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped into the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Deacon. Some people live in their resentment. I was talking to a fellow one time who had a grudge against another person, and he said, "Oh, I forgive that person, but I'll never forget." What good is forgiveness if you have to live in that kind of anger? Then there was another person that I met along the way, a caregiver who had issues with her care receiver, and we tried to have conversations, and I learned long ago from my wife that you should always listen first before giving solutions, and I tried that. But there got to a point where this person needed help, and we needed to draw boundaries, and it seemed like she was drowning, but every time I cast her a lifeline, she refused to hold on to it. It was as if sorrow was her daily bread, and she knew of no other diet. I learned long ago that sometimes seeing a miracle through to the end takes work, or at least the will, on our part. Forgiveness can't lead to reconciliation without some work. Healing can't fix all the things in our life if all we do is wallow in our despair. No wonder for the Jewish theologians, despair is the greatest among all sins. In today's scripture lesson, we meet a man who I am not so sure wants to be healed. Well, maybe it's not that he doesn't want to be healed. Perhaps it's that suffering had become for him such a way of life that he saw no other way to live. He had been ill for 38 years, after all. But wouldn't you think that after all of those years, he would have found his way to that pool? Or at least made one friend to help him get to the pool? You get the sense that his life is rotten, and so either wears that on his sleeve or has only lived up to the labels that people have put upon him. It's like the addict who says, "Let me be, I'm no good, I'm going to die. There's no salvation for me." Of course there's salvation. You just may have to do something about it. You may need to change something. You may need to do something. And all of this is wrapped up in Jesus' question, do you want to be made well? I mean, what kind of question is that? Who doesn't want to be made well? Who doesn't want to experience reconciliation and forgiveness and the freedom that comes with that? Who doesn't want Jesus to make them whole, and who doesn't want to be healed? Well, you'll be surprised. When you read the story in full, you begin to wonder, and you can start to ask the question posed by commentator Gilson Waldkoenig, who asked, does this man suffer from the paralysis of the body or from the paralysis of spirit? Or is it both? And you kind of get the sense from this gentleman that he needs more than just physical healing in his life. If you look closely at your text, you'll find in 3 places that wellness and health come up. This phrase of being made well come up in verse 6, in verse 11, and in verse 14. And when you look at those 3, you can learn something about this text and something deeper, I think, about how Jesus brings healing, and perhaps something about this man when you investigate it further. The first is, of course, in verse 6 when Jesus asks, "Do you want to be made well?" Now, for those of you who are parents in our midst, you may catch very quickly that that's a very simple yes or no question. The reason why I say parents is because if you've ever taken care of children, you know that when you ask a simple yes or no question, sometimes you don't get a yes or a no. And you may have to tell your little one, it's just a yes or no question. Jesus asks a very simple yes or no question. But instead of saying yes or no, the man goes into this long story about how others have failed him, and others have failed to act on his behalf, and people have gotten in the way. And I just want to ask, well, what about you? What is it that you want to do? But Jesus doesn't even ask that question. Jesus cuts through it all. He doesn't waste time, and he simply tells them, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. See, for Jesus, it's that easy. And that's it. He doesn't ask about who gets in your way and how others have failed him. He doesn't ask questions about whether or not he was able to get to the pool. All Jesus does is simply heal him and tell him to get up and walk. It's that simple. Now, the second place where the wellness comes up is in verse 11. A group of Jews see the man carrying his mat, and rather than celebrating his healing, they bully him because on the Sabbath it seems as if he's working. Now, if you focus so much on the law that you fail to celebrate with a man who's been ill for 38 years, I think you may need healing too. And you may be just as sick, and perhaps the system that you've created is sick as well. But then look at how the man responds. He doesn't celebrate either. And he quickly tells the Jewish authorities, well, the man who made me well, he's the one who told me to get up and pick up my mat and walk. It's always about someone else with this guy, isn't it? It seems like he's not only a victim in his illness, but he ends up being a victim in his healing as well. Have you ever met someone who's always the victim? Now, the third focus on wellness comes in verse 14. You have the first one when Jesus says, do you want to be made well? That's verse 6. The second one in verse 11, where the man says, the one who made me well, he's the one we need to blame. And then verse 14, Jesus meets him in the temple again. Why he's there, we don't know. He's still there. Jesus is just as dumbfounded as we are. And Jesus tells him, didn't I make you well? Well, then go and sin no more before something worse happens to you. And here's the key. You have these 3 lines of wellness, verse 6, 11, and 14. And when you look at them all, you start to see that the problem, I think, for this man isn't necessarily all about the sickness. It's not for Jesus anyway. That's easy for Jesus. But it's a different sin altogether of irresponsibility and despair. Does he need permission? Jesus already gave him permission to be healed. Does he need to be empowered? Jesus already empowered him. Pick up your mat and walk. Does he have a gripe against the system in which he lived? Perhaps that could be a reason. Is he just a victim? Maybe. But you start to get the sense, and I do too, of echoing what one commentator wrote, William Barclay, when he says that if in our inmost hearts we are content to stay as we are, there can be no change for us. And that's the problem, isn't it? We want to change, but sometimes we wallow in our sin, enjoying our sin a little bit too much, forgetting the freedom of salvation. Do you want to be saved? Or we brood in anger, and we kind of like living in that place and forget the work of reconciliation. Or perhaps we stay within our victimhood, blaming the world and how the world has failed to act on our behalf, or perhaps how we failed to act on our own behalf, because justice is too lofty a goal, so what can I do anyway? And so there we are with the man, sitting around the pool, wondering whether or not we want to be saved in the first place or healed. And we end up sitting around that pool gossiping one to another and simply blaming others. When we say that the Lamb brings healing and that the Lamb restores, what is it that we mean? And what is the healing that Jesus brings us? For one thing, I think we learn from this text that the healing and the restoration that the Lamb brings is not necessarily one-sided. There is some work that we have to do. It requires action on our part and a little bit of responsibility. And I think the first step is really coming to the place where we have to answer that question: do you want to be made well? I noticed something about our lesson last week I didn't mention in the sermon. We stumbled upon it within our Bible study after. You remember last week we talked about the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And one of the things you'll notice that in this miracle, that the servants had to do a little bit of work. If you recall, Jesus didn't necessarily just create wine out of nothing. Rather, he told the servants, put some water in those jars, pour some water in those jars. And if you remember the details of the story, there were 6 jars, and each of those jars held about 20 to 30 gallons. That's a lot of water. So the servants could have easily said, we don't have time for that. Or they could have said, oh, that's a lot of work. I don't think we can do that, Jesus. But you have to remember, his mother told the servants, this is my son, listen to him. And they had some work to do. They had to fill up those jars before Jesus turned anything into anything else. And not only that, they had to do the work of drawing out that wine for themselves. And I think what this shows us is that in order to see a miracle through, sometimes we need to take responsibility for where we sit in our relationship with the Lord. And we need to be empowered to not only want to be healed, but to have some sweat equity into the game. This August of this year, we'll be observing, as a nation, the 400th anniversary of the first African slave ship to arrive to the shores of America. In response to that, conservative columnist David Brooks of the New York Times wrote an article called The Case for Reparations, and in that article he tries to dissect the argument for reparations, and he joins the African American community in agreeing that we need to make reparations, not necessarily money or anything like that, but rather in a change of relationships and how we do race reconciliation. And what caught my attention was that he uses this language in which he said that we've been speaking as a nation in terms of what he called resentment narratives for such a long time that we forget we have to do the work in creating and building what he calls reconciliation narratives. It's just another fancy way of saying that we need to change how we speak about things and take responsibility and turn those resentment narratives into reconciliation narratives. And that is one way of going about restoration. And I think that's what is happening in this text with Jesus. I think that Jesus is coming along and exposing this man's resentment narrative in which everything is everyone else's fault, and rather empowers him to change that story to become a reconciliation narrative. Such a way that when he finds the man at the temple, he tells him very simply, you better move along or something worse may happen to you. And not only that, I think Jesus is empowering this man to turn his resentment narrative into a reconciliation narrative, not only for his own sake and for the fact that he had to be in this position for over 38 years, but for the very faulty system in which he worked. You have to remember, folks, that after you've helped the man who's been beaten up on the road to Jericho so many times, eventually you have to fix the road to Jericho in the first place. And take responsibility for the safety of the road that goes down to Jericho so that no one else gets thrown to the curb. The Jews actually bully him and reveal that the man may actually be right. There's something wrong with the institution in which people are focusing so much on the law that they can't see past the law in order to celebrate the fact that Jesus came to restore and bring healing. And they need a healing too. They need to take some responsibility as well. And so here we have, and here we are, not only us, but the systems and institutions that we create that remain broken for as long as we fail to act more like victims than we are people who are empowered and healed by the Lamb, the one who brings salvation, the one who brings reconciliation, and the one who saves us. We fail to come to that place where we sit at Jesus' feet and can answer that question, Do you want to be made well? We forget that we need to participate not only in our own miracle, but also in the healing of the world around us. And it starts with us. Do you want to be made well? Do I want to be made well? Now, we don't need a speech. This is a simple yes or no question. And if you answer yes, then get up and carry your mat and walk. Haley played for me one of her favorite songs yesterday. She came and said, Daddy, you have to hear one of my favorite songs. I said, sure, okay, fine. So I sat down and we listened to her favorite songs. And one of the lyrics in the song simply says, carry your world. And I thought, what an amazing line. And I think what a lesson for today's church. That when Jesus comes to us, we need to pick up our mat and we need to carry our world. So you have to remember, it was the wisest man in Greece who once said, know thyself, Socrates. It was the wisest man in Rome, Marcus Aurelius, who once said, control thyself. But it was the wisest man in Galilee who challenges us to deny ourselves, to pick up our cross, to carry the world, and to follow him. Do you want to be made well? We don't need any excuses. It's a yes or no question. Amen.